Welcome to Not Your Ordinary Parts, a podcast where we talk about hard things associated with the human experience with the goal of increasing awareness, growth, and healing. You may hear information from professionally licensed therapists, life coaches, healers, doctors, etc. This information is not medical advice or therapy and is not meant to replace actual therapy or instructions given by a doctor or a personal therapist. I'm your host, Jalon Johnson. My guest today is Dr. Danica Harris. Dr. Harris is a trauma therapist and somatic healing practitioner who specializes in complex trauma, identity based trauma, and nervous system regulation. She is the co founder of Empowered Healing Dallas, a social justice informed therapy practice dedicated to providing affirming, inclusive, and accessible mental health care to marginalized communities. Dr. Harris holds a Ph.D. in counseling psychology from Texas Women's University and has spent over a decade helping individuals heal from trauma, develop self-compassion, and reconnect with their bodies in the therapeutic process. Dr. Harris integrates somatic therapy, self-trust work, and relational healing into her practice, offering a holistic approach to trauma recovery that goes beyond traditional talk therapy. And she is passionate about dismantling harmful narratives around trauma, self-worth, and identity, particularly for people of color, LGBTQ plus individuals, and those navigating intergenerational trauma. Through her work, she's not just helping people heal, she's redefining what healing looks like, making it more accessible, embodied, and deeply personal. So, Dr. Harris, welcome to the show, and thank you so much for being my guest.
Yes, thank you for having me.
I gave a bit of an introduction, but so that the audience can get to know you a little bit better, would you mind giving us a little bit of background about yourself and how you got to who and where you are today, please?
Sure. Yeah. Um, how I got here is it's a bit of like a winding road.
Mhm.
So I grew up, I'm from or have lived in the Dallas area most of my life and grew up in a working class family. So just even going to college at all was pretty out there. It wasn't something I was encouraged to do or even thought would happen and didn't happen initially. So initially, when I graduated high school, I earned an esthetician's license and worked in the skincare field for about 9 years and just really wanted to go back to school, really wanted to go back to school. And I knew all along that I wanted to really be a therapist. Grew up in a family, though, that didn't believe in therapy. If that was kind of the story. Um, and I myself saw a therapist when I was a teenager. And after a lot of hardship to be able to do that. I was about 16 and I saw my first therapist. I had such a positive experience that I just like always came back to that. Like I would love to be a therapist. I would love to be a therapist. And so when I returned to school in my late 20s, I went to school for psychology and then went on to the master's program and then I got invited into a doctoral program, which is exactly what I wanted to do. Anyway, so became a counseling psychologist when I graduated. Had no intention of doing private practice. I actually was like very anti private practice. I thought that does not sound appealing. That sounds very lonely. I don't want to be on my own. And then I had this like epiphany that like, oh, I don't have to be alone. I could be in a group practice or I could work with a partner or something like that. And that just happened to coincide with a work experience that was like really not good. And so I knew I needed to divest from the systems that I was working in and create something that felt good for me to be able to do true trauma healing work. And that's how I've landed here, a lifetime of trying to find my own spaces and then creating one.
Thank you for sharing that. How would you say, since you've gotten to where you are now, your journey has been as a healer and a trauma specialist?
I learn a little bit more every single day about myself and about the world. And that learning has softened me so much. And I think that a previous version of me had to be really guarded and really protected and very perfectionistic and very strategic. And, I was, as most complex trauma survivors are, we become very vigilant to the world
Mm,
around us. And I lived a very vigilant life. And I think my healing as I'm in my own process and in my own journey, I soften more and more all the time and feel less vigilant. So it's not that I have lost that skill or capability. Certainly, if I'm activated or triggered, I can turn on that vigilance, but I don't find that I'm living every day in that space anymore. And I think that that has actually just afforded me a lot of flexibility in my life that I did not once have.
That's huge.
Mhm.
If we can we get a little bit into your early life and what it was like for you growing up and your experiences with connection, healing, and understanding and feeling your emotions?
Yeah. I definitely grew up in one of those households where like emotions did not get discussed. The only emotion that I have a very clear memory of seeing was anger.
Mm,
Um, it kind of felt like, and I have many clients over the years who've described something similar. Like it kind of felt like there was only intensity of emotion. Like we didn't get to experience what I would consider like neutral or mundane experiences. It was like we either, and I'm saying we, meaning each person in the family system, either had to be almost like elated, excited, thrilled. Like there almost had to be this like unhinged sort of happiness, which felt like even saying it now, I'm like, was anyone ever actually like that? But it was there was this expectation of that someone would be like so excited, or it felt like the opposite, where it was like big experiences of anger. And then like the rest of the time it was like almost like no emotionality felt present or accessible. And um yeah, I would say like my parents were the sort of people that like swept things under the rug, and there wasn't, like I mentioned, working class family, so they worked really hard, they worked really long hours. So, in terms of, like, providing for me in the physical sense, they did that. Like, I had a place to lay my head down, I had food, things like that. And, it's so interesting even, like, saying that back to you, because when a client says that to me, it's my first sign that there was emotional neglect, right? I'm like, "Oh,
mhm,
if we're counting I had a place to lay my head down as, like, my parents were good parents, that's a clear sign that something else was missing." And so I was, like many of the clients I've come to work with, I was experiencing a lot of emotional neglect. I identify as being a highly sensitive person. My emotions have always been very palpable, very present. There was no room for that. In fact, like being sensitive was often something that was like remarked as a negative thing and be like, "Oh, you're so sensitive." There was a lot of like teasing in my household, like that I should have just like, I guess, been okay with. I never felt okay with it. And so I think, I felt on the outside a lot. I felt on the outside of my family system. I really excelled in school, which also like kind of put me on the outside. Yeah, growing up in a working class family, my dad very much had this idea that like we would work with our hands, not our head. And like he himself is a smart person, but has a second grade education. And so he was very limited to the sort of work he could do. And so it was just very much encouraged for me that like once I get out of high school, I should do a trade of some sort and begin working. And I mean, that's essentially what I did. So I think the household itself, like it just didn't, there was no space to grow or to be a complex person or being, or to even consider like what might I actually want to do, because it was a lot about survival, both emotionally and then also just with lacking resources.
Thank you for sharing that. And I think a lot of individuals may have heard that, you got a roof over your head, shoes on your feet, clothes on your back. You have more than a lot of people have, so you should be grateful, right? And then I think when we start to accept that as our reality, we can overlook the fact that there may be emotional neglect, or we might not even think that too little of having our emotional needs met can be traumatic or can have an effect on our nervous system. How do you see people who have experienced emotional neglect who didn't know it was a thing?
Mhm.
How do you see that shaping their nervous systems?
I think it has I think emotional neglect and, like, going too long without something we need is actually so detrimental to our nervous system, and I think one of the greatest problems with emotional neglect is that our brain tries to talk us out of it. So, like, for those, and I'm never gonna be in the comparison game. We don't need to compare one trauma to another and say, like, which is worse, right? But if someone grows up in a home with a consistently violent caregiver, over time, it's easily easier not easy, it's easier to identify that caregiver as like a bad person or a harmful person or an unsafe person, because the harm is consistent and it's overt. But when
Mm,
we have a caregiver who's like home after school or making sure to get us to soccer practice or whatever it is, right? Like they're there in the like physical manifestations of a family unit. Our brain does this weird thing where it's like, well, they must love me because they're here. I can see them. But then like they never say I love you. And when you're
Mm.
crying, they say I'll give you something to cry about. But then the
Mm.
next morning you've got breakfast on the table, right? And so I think it's actually like that is so disorienting to our systems because our brain works to counter the narrative we know is true inside of us, which is I'm not getting what I need. And I think that not only does it disrupt like our nervous system and keeps us like in constant pursuit of wanting something we're not getting, but we don't even know how to name that because our brain is seeing it so differently. Our brain is like, but they're here. So I must not have had trauma. And I think it's that discrepancy that actually causes us the most internal distress.
I mean, it's so confusing because I mean, as you were talking, like I got the mental picture of someone being tortured, and I was like, wow, I never thought about it like that. Because someone who is like a prisoner or who's being tortured, they will constantly be treated terrible, and then they'll be given a meal and made to feel like everything is okay. And I think it's that confusion that disrupts you internally and makes you not know what to expect. And even though you may not be, a prisoner of war or someone who's like locked in a basement, if you're experiencing that same confusion, that could be traumatic. And I'm sure, especially at a young age, it could have some detrimental effects on brain development.
Absolutely, it does. Yeah.
Mm.
Well, yeah, because a little kid, we like children don't experience the world in the same complexity that adults do. Right. So, like, here's this little kid that's like, well, so innately, like, I know what I need. I need my caregiver to be available to me. And I think an adult can be like, well, I'm here. Like, look, I'm right here. Whereas, like, the kid, like, doesn't even know how to articulate or doesn't even know that they would need to do so to say, like, no, like, I need you emotionally to be here. And I think that, adults like, whether it's someone who's intentionally causing harm to their child or it's someone who, because of their own life circumstances, their own trauma is just not emotionally available to their kid. Like, uh, I don't think, I want to believe most parents or most caregivers are not intentionally causing harm to their children. But I think this is where we get such a disconnect because adults will be like, no, you didn't have a traumatic childhood. Like I was there too. I know it wasn't traumatic. And like for the kid though, for the child's nervous system, for the kid getting like what they needed, like it probably was traumatic. If they're saying it was traumatic, it was traumatic, right? And so I think
Mhm.
there's this huge then like cultural or societal disconnect too, where like family systems will invalidate people. So then what ends up happening, especially with emotional neglect, is the trauma compounds, right? Because it's like every single time you're invalidated, every single time you're dismissed, every single time you're overlooked, every time you're emotional and no one's there for you. And those wounds really add up and they can exist across someone's lifetime.
Like you mentioned earlier, that if someone, or in your instance, you were teased for being sensitive. And I think in a family system or just community or any relationship where other people can't hold space for their feelings or your emotions, I think that teasing is a way to basically say, I don't want to feel my feelings. So instead of, accepting what you're trying to give me, I'm going to make you seem like there's something wrong with you for having normal human functions.
Yep. I so agree with you. Yeah, I had chills when you
Mhm.
said that.
And all of these things can develop into trauma. But you also specialize in complex trauma and somatic healing. So I wanted to ask, can you explain what complex trauma is and how it affects the body and how it's different than just trauma?
Mhm. Yeah, complex trauma is the sustained and repeated experience of enduring something that is too much or not enough for your nervous system. So it's
Mm.
like too much for too long or not enough for too long. And our nervous system learns to basically accommodate what we're not getting or what we're getting too much of. And therefore, we're no longer able to like respond to our environment purely as it exists, right? But like that trauma response becomes embedded in who we are and how we show up. Certainly how we see the world, how we see ourselves. And so when I think about complex trauma, I think about the compounding nature of not having your needs met, experiencing harm, enduring anything that your nervous system really can't handle.
Mhm. I don't think anybody would discourage someone from going to therapy. And also, at a certain point, talk therapy may not be enough anymore. And that's why you include the body into your practice and what you do, because the nervous system may need to be tended to.
Mhm.
What is it that somatic work does that talk therapy can't do?
I think it gets us out of our intellectual being.
Mm,
One of my, like, beefs with some trauma modalities, so, like, the top-down sort of, like, cognitive approaches is that, um, most trauma survivors can tell you their trauma story. That doesn't heal anything, though. Like, someone retelling their story over and over. Now, is there value in saying your truth and having it validated? Of course. But if someone isn't able to move through the held trauma responses that they have, so, like, let's say as a kid you did feel trapped, like your example of like feeling like a prisoner. Like, lots of children felt trapped in their childhood. So you might have all this pent up energy of feeling like you needed to flee. You had a flight response that didn't get to be completed. Like, the child maybe, like, what did you want to do when your parents were not attending to you? The child maybe wanted to run away. Well, that held response is in the body. And so somatic work can really help us to move through that flight response or through the fight response if that's what's held. And really help us get to a state where it's like, oh, I actually now, me, my brain, and also my body can recognize I'm actually safe or relatively safe right here, right now. Because that's what happens. Like, and this has been one of the coolest things in doing somatic work with my clients over the years is once we really get to understand, like, what are the patterns, how is this showing up, how's it showing up interpersonally, and if I ask someone, like, when did you first realize you were safe following
mm,
your childhood, no one's ever been able to answer it,
wow,
because there's not often, with complex trauma, there's not often one defining moment where you're like, it's over.
mm,
And I think especially for those of us who have been invalidated even as we've entered into adulthood, like, if our family systems continue to invalidate us, then the message in our body is, I don't know if I'm safe. And if we don't know we're safe, we're going to remain super vigilant and really, protecting ourselves. And, like, whatever our defensive strategies are that come up, we're going to stay in that. So somatic work helps us to understand I always think, like, the difference between perceived threat and actual threat. The difference of I don't feel safe versus I'm not safe. And so somatic work helps us to kind of feel into the safety both, like, externally and also internally. And then we can get to a place where we're like, it's over.
mm.
And now I can, like, live my life.
So, because the brain can't tell the difference between same and similar, like you said, I don't feel safe and I'm not safe. How do you help people get to a point where they can, even if their brain is telling them we're not safe, they can take a step back and kind of like scan their environment to come to the realization that they are safe, and then kind of honor their body for giving them the message, but say, okay, I understand what you're trying to tell me, but also we're okay.
Yeah. Well, and it's exactly what you're saying. It's creating a little bit of space between, oh, I had that quick feeling of I'm not safe, and, like, creating enough space to say, like, let me check that out to see if that's real. Like, am
Mm,
I actually not safe? And for most complex trauma survivors who haven't done this healing work yet or haven't incorporated the body in their healing work, the time between I'm not safe and whatever their action is around I'm not safe is so quick, the brain's offline. So if we can slow down, we can invite the brain in. And then we can really say, like, it's exactly you said, scan the environment. Is this true? Am I actually not safe? And not ever in a way to invalidate ourselves, but to say, like, okay, what I'm experiencing is an internal reaction to something either internal or external. That's real and valid, but that might not mean I'm unsafe. And so it's
mm,
like we have to almost, like, be curious, slow it down. And what that often looks like with clients when I'm working with them is we're trying to slow it down in non-threatening situations. So I might, if we're feeling okay today, I might say, like, let's take a moment and just tell me, like, something that in the room that we're in that catches your eye that's, like, neutral or north of neutral. So we're building the tolerance for slowing down because so many complex trauma survivors run on urgency. We're
Mhm.
moving so quick and we're not really taking in our environment. Like, I mean, think about how many times you've maybe like transitioned from one room to another. Are you actually looking at like every single thing in the room? Of course not. But if and it wouldn't be wise to do that every day, all the time, right? But when we're trying to teach the body how to slow down, we do it in a safe enough environment or a neutral enough environment first so that we have it practiced so that the next time we feel unsafe, we can return to that skill.
Thank you for explaining that way. And I wanted to ask a question about what it means to be embodied, because if you're not connected to your body, like what's happening? Like where would you be? I've heard people say, you need to drop down into your body. Where are you if you're not there?
I think we are just existing collarbones up most of the time, you know? It's like we're here enough, like to where I can hear you, I can see you. But like to be embodied is like, to me anyway, is to like know I have a full being, that
Mhm.
energy runs through my being, that like as I sit here and talk to you right now, I can feel my feet on the floor. And sometimes when I'm working with someone somatically and they're new to this work, and I just ask them, like, do you know you have legs? Like sometimes they'll laugh and then they'll be like, actually, no, I don't feel them. And
Oh.
I think that's a reality. So many of us are so disconnected from our bodies. And one of the things I often talk about in my like on Instagram and in my newsletters is like even like beginning a practice of like getting your basic needs met. Like that's how you become more embodied. Like, do you know when you're thirsty? Do you know when you're hungry? Do you know when you need to go to the bathroom? Like a lot of us turn off those cues, you know, and certainly even if we didn't have like a true complex trauma experience, like kids are taught to disconnect from hunger, thirst, and bathroom cues in elementary school.
Mm.
It's like you have to ask to go to the bathroom. You can't have water, or you have to go to the fountain, or I think kids can carry bottles now, but you know, lunch break is at a certain time. It's not when like what's intuitive. So like we have a lot of systems in place that we all are just brought up under. And then on top of that, you know, many of us have complex trauma too. It's just no wonder people are disconnected from themselves, you know? And so to be embodied to me is to like know you have a body and to be able to know that like you have a self that exists within that body and that you have needs and sensations and cues and messages from your body to tend to. So it's just being aware more of you's there.
Okay, so what if like, you started in elementary school and you were trained to ignore the cues from your body?
Mhm.
And then you get to a point where maybe at home it's not a safe environment and you completely learn to not feel your feelings.
Yep.
How difficult can it be to start feeling your feelings?
I think it can be profoundly difficult and also very, very uncomfortable and probably painful,
Mm,
depending on what our experience was.
I see. And for individuals who are just starting down that path to feeling their feelings, what kind of sensations can they get in their body to recognize that they are safe and that their body is just trying to talk to them?
Mhm. Yeah, you know, I think safety looks and feels different for all of us. Like, for me, safety feels like expansion. Like when I feel like this like opening in my chest where I feel like, oh, I don't have to be curled in. I don't have to, you know, hunch or protect. I don't have to like, you know, kind of curl inward. I can like actually just like be and I can exist. And like I can feel the energy flowing through me. It's not a threat for energy to exist.
Mm,
That's what safety feels like to me. You know, some people will talk about like a warmness in their heart center and their stomach. Maybe even like, you know, if they have a sense of their third eye feels more open. They might notice less tension in their body. So I'm not needing to constrict. I can like open up a little bit. Um, Someone might say that, you know, they feel more inclined to like get some of those basic needs met because they're hearing the cues more often. So, you know, I think safety can look like so many different things. And what I'm always encouraging clients to do is like, let's just find any like 1% safer. Like, let's start there. We're just looking
mm.
to move the dial a little bit. Like, can you trust you? Because that's really what we want. We want to get to the place where like I trust me to meet my own needs and not out of a place of survival, but out of a place of love.
Oof. Wow, that's huge, especially if you've been living in survival mode or if survival mode is all you know, like getting to a place of getting your needs met just because you matter. That can feel so, off.
Yeah, often like scary,
Mhm.
maybe even dangerous.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah. I remember when my therapist told me to do body checks every so often, just take a second and see where you are and if there's any tension in your body. And I would like stop and then I'd be like, oh, like wow, like my shoulders are tight, my hands are tight, my feet are tight. Like I'm always in a position of like ready to go in case something happens. And then as I do that, like I keep checking in and I'm like, oh wow, just relax.
Yep.
Just try and relax. And I still do it now. Like I can check every 5 minutes, something is tense.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Well, and I'll talk to clients about that being like a holding pattern, right? So there's like a holding
Mhm.
pattern in your body that says like, I need to be ready to go. And, it's like we want to be grateful for surviving. Like, past you got you here, past me got me here. So like, I never want to be like hard on myself for any of that holding pattern that comes back up, but I do want to always invite it to change. Like, and
Mhm.
not aggressively like, oh, why am I holding again? But just like, okay, like what's actually going on for me? Why is the holding increasing? And now I'm approaching it with curiosity and interest as opposed to judgment.
Mhm. That's so important. So important. Thank you for saying that. Um, your work also focuses a lot on identity-based trauma. So I wanted to ask you, how do racism, sexism, homophobia, and oppression affect mental health in ways that traditional therapy may often overlook?
I think when the world is unsafe for us, dependent on the identities we hold, the intersection of those identities, that really magnifies our internal sense of lack of safety, especially for those of us that also had the experience of trauma in our household. So it's like,
Mhm.
well, my home isn't safe, and neither is the world. So I must not be safe. And it's really hard, and I think, like, traditional therapy needs to, like, absolutely must consider that if we are helping people heal into a world where, and I mean, therapy is political, we exist in it, our bodies are political, um, if we're helping people heal into a world where, like, the reality is discrimination is happening, harm is happening, threat is occurring at differential rates for people based on their identities. If we're not taking that into consideration, we're not actually helping anybody heal at all.
Mm. That's so true. Um, you also work with helping people of color and marginalized people to feel seen, heard, and safe. What advice would you give someone who's trying to find a therapist who truly understands their experience?
Trust your gut and your intuition. And if you do not feel like someone is safe, I would want someone to trust that so fully. And I think there's a big difference between a therapist like desiring to be safe, meaning that they are engaging in behaviors, routine behaviors that demonstrate safety as a person, versus a therapist who decides, I'm a therapist, therefore I am safe. I
Mm.
think the latter is a lot of times what happens. Therapist is like, this is a safe space. No, safety is co-created. And
Right,
I
says
I
who?
can't I can't just arrive at being a safe human, right? Like, I don't know, am I safe for you or not? You're the one that's gonna tell me. And so
Yeah.
I imagine even the clients I work with, like, they probably feel, if we were to line them up and ask them, differential degrees of safety even with me, right? And some of that's gonna be informed by their lived experience, but also, like, our stuff as it comes up in the moment. Like, it's entirely possible someone who feels a little more connected to me for whatever reason is going to feel safer than someone who is less connected. Well, that can be true with like lived experience too. And I think the other thing that therapists can sometimes get in this habit of is almost like trying to help themselves or clients arrive at this like capital T truth. And like the truth that matters is the one that's real to you and your nervous system. So I'm
Mm.
not an investigator alongside my clients. I'm a support. I'm here to validate. So like your lived experience, I've got no questions about that. It's just now, how do we help you move through that? So any therapist who's, or any healer who's doing work to like discount or try to like modify or repackage your experience and trying to like put a bow on it in some way, or this like concept of like post traumatic growth, like yeah, is there growth from heartache and pain? Sure, but anyone who's like leaning in that direction, that doesn't sit well with me, because that's not That's like saying, like, you are who you are because you've been through this awful thing, and we are who we are, and also we experienced something awful that we've had to heal from. And so I just don't like any sort of like um exploration that feels like it's trying to prove something or trying to put a positive spin. Like, let's just sit with the trauma as it is and let's like have capacity to do that. And if a therapist can't do that, they're not doing trauma work.
Mm. I love the duality that you put on that because two things can coexist at one time. I mean, multiple things can. So you don't have to be what someone says you are, especially if it's not what you feel.
Right.
Mm. You've talked about how we internalize the voice of those who harmed us. How do you start to challenge that and unlearn self criticism that may keep your clients stuck?
This is one of the hardest things.
Mm.
Yeah, in at least in my experience, like I will often write about this topic because I find it to be um just such a hard thing for people to even introduce a different voice, right? Like if you grew up in a household where believing so for children who have an unreliable, unpredictable, chaotic, harmful caregiver, it's a lot better for them to develop the perspective that like I must be bad. It must be
Mm.
my fault. Because if I have to believe my caregiver, who's the adult, is the problem, that's a lot more dangerous. Because then it's like, oh, well, if they're if they're the problem, am I actually gonna live? Right. So the child will adopt this perspective of like, I am wrong, I am flawed. Now, sometimes they're also given that narrative by their family system. So then of course it just gets compounded. So I find that sometimes survivors will have such a grip on this negative self narrative because they think it's like necessary for them to have and because they grew up with no other narrative. So here I am encouraging a little bit more of a positive narrative, or like, could we just see ourselves a little more fully? Or like, could we validate this pain that you have? And I feel that sometimes people will think it's like too risky because they like have learned, well, this is what saved me to be hard on myself. This is how I get anything done. So the work for me in this is like encouraging people to just like, could we just again move? We're just moving the dial a little bit at a time. 1%. Could you validate this? Could you? I'm validating you. I'm telling you this sounds like a horrible freaking experience and I can't imagine what that felt like to you. Can you hear me say that? And so a lot of times my clients will remark, like, a couple years into their process, like, it was so much easier for me to believe you saw me than for me to see myself. But at some point, I started seeing me. So I'm
Mm.
hoping to, like, model that for them and be a reparative experience that, they should have had when they were young and didn't get.
It sounds like you're for sure establishing safety for them, even if they don't know how to recognize it at first. You're creating a safe space for them to be able to get to a point where they can just be honest.
I certainly hope so. I mean, that's definitely the goal. It's like if their system can settle for the 1 hour that they see me a week or every other week, and that's the only place that their system settles, like, well, let's validate the heck out of you while you're here. So you go back
Mm.
out into the world, and the world's hard on us, and
Yeah.
I just want to help people be a little bit softer.
Mm. I think you are. So,
Thank you.
trust is big for people who struggle with trauma. Learning how to trust again, not just others but themselves. How can someone start rebuilding self trust after years of betrayal or invalidation?
Counting every single little thing you do. So like
Mm.
you just, you brought your water bottle into session today, like self-trust. You are prepared if you're thirsty. So you can count on you to meet your thirst cues. You can count on you to have water available. You needed to go to the bathroom and you went. That counts, right? So I'm trying to encourage like any small gesture. So, if someone's really struggling with self-trust, I might even ask them to tell me about the last 24 hours. We can always find many, many things. They're not counting them, but they're there. Anytime you stretch, like even in session, someone might do that. Like they might just, ooh, pull their shoulders back a little bit. That you had a cue and you listened to it. So like we're just looking for any little micro place we can give you a little bit of credit and say like, look, something happened in your body and then you attended to it. And you probably do that so many times in a day and you're not even counting it. So I want us to just start counting it. so that over time it gets a little bit easier to be like, well, yeah, if I'm wanting to say no to a dinner plan with a friend, I can get there, right? But we can't start there. Someone who's like never been able to say no to someone, who's people pleasing through their whole life, we can't start with just having them tell someone no. We have to start with something like, oh, when I'm thirsty, I drink water. And then we build over time.
That people may look at that and be like, "But that's so simple." But also, like, if you've been trained to ignore cues, you have to start small.
Right. Yeah.
You have
You're
to.
you're right. People do say it's simple, and then when we get into it, it's like, "Oh, but you're not doing it." Right? So
Mhm.
if it were truly a simple thing, all of us would be so hydrated, well nourished, well rested, and that's just not the case.
Yeah. You mentioned something, people pleasing. What is people pleasing and how can trauma have an effect on whether we people please or not?
Well, I think people pleasing is an attempt to stay safe, right?
Mm.
If I keep you happy, you're not looking at me. So I'm diverting the attention elsewhere. Children will develop, I always call these the most advantageous coping skills because people pleasing and perfectionism look good. And they're often highly successful coping skills, right? Whereas like some people may utilize a substance to cope. Well, that's socially unacceptable. And when it starts to get extreme versus like people pleasing, those people often get promoted at work. So it becomes like a real difficult thing for us to get over when it's like, oh, but the thing that I did to survive is advantageous and also I get rewarded for it. So I think all of these though are equal to me. They're equal strategies to create safety and also like to disconnect from the pain we're experiencing.
Wow. It can be so hard to look at it as just that because who would think that people pleasing is like the same as using a substance to cope? But if you're trying to stay safe or maybe stay small and be unseen or not feel, it's no different.
Right. They're both a diversion from the self, right? If I'm pleasing
Yeah.
you, then I don't even have to have a need at all.
Wow.
And
That's so deep.
if I am using substances that disconnect me from my body, I don't have to know I have needs. So to me, they're, opposite sides of the same coin.
Wow. That's so deep. Um, so not only clients, you also mentor and train other therapists. What is your biggest hope for the next generation of mental health professionals?
Mm. I hope that therapists will divest from some of their learning. In graduate school, it's and I feel like I had a positive graduate school experience. I went to a feminist multicultural program. We were not um super CBT trained by any means, and not to just knock on CBT. It's just not a standalone for everybody. Um But I think sometimes therapists get worried about like doing the right thing according to like some theory or diagnostic manual. And they sometimes can lose the perspective of the human being sitting across from them. And I really think that like a true natural therapist, someone who like can allow their humanity to show. Like human to human, I want to validate another person. That's not an intervention. That's not a therapy approach. That's like my humanity wants to be with and honor your humanity. And I really think, especially when we're talking about complex trauma and healing, therapists need to be showing up that way. And so I sometimes want to encourage therapists, like, don't worry if you're doing it by the book. Like, yes, learn your basic skills. Of course, get your ethics down. We want appropriately trained therapists. But I think in order to meet people where they're at, we have to like lean into our humanity and get outside of the theoretical approaches a little bit.
It sounds like you really want healing for others, and it's not necessarily about you. Let's say 40 years from now, people are talking about your practice. What would you hope they would say?
Mm, gosh, you know what? I have this like deep urge to be a role model, but not for what I achieve, which a previous version of me would have wanted, but to be a role model in healing. Like I would just love if I got to a place where someone was like, I saw she did it, so I know I could. and I mean that with healing, not achieving
Mhm.
anything, I would just feel like, well, our work here is done. Like if we can role model healing for people, we're doing the best work. And that is why I over the years I share a little more about my story. I always disclose to clients I'm a complex trauma survivor. I think that's important for people to know. Like I've walked this walk and I've not arrived at healed. We'll be healing till our last days, and then, energetically, generationally it carries on. So I think being a role model in healing is really, really important to me.
Mhm. I think therapy can be intimidating for a lot of people, and for others, it may be something that's inaccessible. For people who have taken a chance and were courageous and bold enough to, you know, log on to Zoom or step into your office, do you think that sharing your story about being a complex trauma survivor makes it easier for them to open up and feel seen and heard?
I do. And I actually think it even more now than I used to. We've hosted a couple healing retreats, and I love healing, like group healing spaces. It's like, oh, I just love it, love it, love it. Because I think when you put a bunch of people who are healing together, the energy in that space, the validation that can exist, the knowing, just like, yeah, we both know we have different lived experiences, but we know what that feels like. Um, I've just seen like such profound and powerful change. And we saw that, I'm saying we, a couple of us that are in my practice that facilitated these retreats in 2023. We shared a little bit about our stories there, and people shared a little bit about their own stories. And watching the transformation happen and watching the safety that just like it felt like it completely unfolded by day two. Like, here are all these strangers coming together, yet there's a shared experience that like opens everyone up to just heal and be with themselves. It was so beautiful. And I think about that as like such a transformative experience for me of like, yeah, from here forward, it's important that I really acknowledge this. And I think that I've been a little more open since that experience because it's shown me that like this idea of traditional therapy where like the therapist does not disclose much isn't always the best approach. And really like being alongside someone again in that my humanity, their humanity is really valuable.
Mm. Your social media, Instagram in particular, is also full of the most insightful and relatable content. Do you think that opening up about your story or maybe some of the experiences that you've had that were heart opening um, give you more encouragement to continue posting relatable content? And how has it been? And like, what type of responses have you gotten?
Yeah, I often find that the posts or the content that I'm sharing that's more personal um gets a lot of like warm and encouraging responses. So a lot of times I'll say this sometimes in my stories, like I'm writing to you, but I'm writing to me too.
Mhm.
And I think especially if it's something I'm like really working through or really contending with myself, if I write about it, I'm sure I'm writing about it in a more passion filled way. It seems like, or even if I like disclose something in like my captions or something, I find that people are very drawn to that. And it's such a like an interesting thing for me, like being so public, right? And like just sharing pieces of my life. And because it's just not something like therapists are taught to do. And I'm always thinking about like how will this affect a client, or and I think there's a really big difference between taking up their therapeutic space or their coaching space and like talking about myself unprompted versus like sharing about it more publicly, and they could choose to opt in or opt out of that information.
Yeah, I agree with that. What are some of the misconceptions about trauma healing that you see on social media, and how do you feel about them?
We could talk for another whole hour about this. you know I'll sum it up, I'll be brief.
Okay. All
you
right.
know
Cool.
I think I love, let me start with the positive. I love that more people are talking about trauma, more people are normalizing complex trauma, more people are honoring that this is a real lived experience for people. That's huge. That wasn't happening a decade ago. So, or when I entered the field, I mean, we're in a really different place with that. So I feel like that is a positive. But like when something becomes popular, the message gets diluted, right? So there are a lot of people now I was just saying this earlier today, like using somatics, like they're like the somatic this, somatic that. It's like somatic workouts, somatic blah 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 blah, and it's like people who have, from what I can see, they do not have the experience, the training, the personal experience to be doing that. And so I do have this like fear sometimes that people who are not trained and also maybe haven't done their own healing work or out here talking about trauma in ways that could potentially be not helpful. Um, so yeah, I have this fear about it. Sometimes I also think people are like posting in a way that's like, well, that sounds good, but like that's not doable or that's not real, right? It'll almost be like quick fix kind of stuff. And the truth, and this is a sad truth, is that like we don't know how long it's going to take someone to feel better inside their body. It takes time, and like I like those messages the most. That's very realistic of like we're gonna attend to you and your nervous system. My hope would be you feel some relief right away, but I don't know. I don't know what the timeline's gonna look like.
Let me ask you this, building off of that. If you could change one thing about mental health and trauma healing, the way it's approached, what would it be?
Mm. One thing, okay. You know what I would really want therapists to stop, or just anyone doing mental health healing stuff. Um, I would want people to stop focusing on the trauma story, the narrative, the details, and focus on what is the outcome that this person that's sitting across from you right here right now is experiencing. So like I'm as a healer, as a provider, I'm happy to hear anything a client wants to say, but I don't need them to detail every horrible thing they've ever experienced in their life because their body sits with it right here right now. I don't need them to say it out loud for my benefit. I wanna know, like, what are the ways this is showing up? Like, you're not sleeping, you're not tending to your hunger cues, you're not feeling connected to people in your life, you feel pretty lonely, whatever it is. I wanna work with those pieces. So I think I would want the field to kinda shift its focus. Like, let's and I think this is happening in some circles. But I think, like, getting out of the trauma narrative and, like, let's just get people into their body as quickly as we can, not flood them, not rush them, but
Mm.
let's do that work. That's what's most important.
Okay, a little bit more of a personal question. With all the work that you're doing to help others, what is it that you want people to know most?
I mean, it's simple and it's not. I want people to know that healing is possible and that you don't have to live the way you've always lived.
Mm. That is pretty simple, but I think for people who are stuck in trauma cycles or, just emotional memories that give them responses and coping and things of that nature, just the thought of that may mean like having to start over from ground zero and, you know, live a new life.
Yeah, and we don't have to change everything all at once, you know?
Right. Yeah.
Like,
1%.
yeah, sometimes it's just little changes and, um, you know, I can say this from my own lived experience, like, my life looks today nothing like I would have imagined it looked like, and thank goodness for that.
Mhm. All right. Let me ask you a question, right? You're at an award ceremony and you've been nominated Therapist of the Year.
Okay.
Who do you thank when you go up on stage to give your speech?
Well, I mean, I had 2 thoughts at the exact same time. One of them sounds a little egocentric, but it's true. I think I would thank younger me because my goodness, was she resilient.
Mm.
So far beyond what she should have ever had to be. And beyond that, I had a really amazing therapist at a time in my life when I needed any adult to show up, and she did.
Thank you for sharing that. All right, last question. If you could use your platform to educate anyone who may be struggling with their mental or emotional health and might be uncertain of how or where to start, what do you say to them?
You've already started
Mm.
because you survived.
Wow. Thank you for that. Thank you for this. Thank you for your time. Thank you to younger you who's gotten you here. It wasn't egocentric to thank her at all. I'm really grateful for the opportunity to share space with you and have a deep conversation about complex things and the work that you do to make them, simplify it for anybody who's willing to listen.
Yeah, thank you so much. This has been really nice.
If people want to find you online or on social media, where can they find you?
Mostly on Instagram at The Empowered Therapist, but you can also find me at the empoweredtherapist.com or empoweredhealingdallas.com.
Okay, great. All right, Dr. Harris. Well, again, thank you for your time. Thank you for sharing. Thank you for who you are. Thank you for what you do. And thank you for how you do it.
Thank you for having this space.